All right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're joining us from. Welcome to the Brownfields Back Better Fiscal Year 22 ARC Grant Writing Webinar. Weeks ago, EPA posted the request application and the guidelines for the Brownfields Assessment, Cleanup, and Revolving Loan Fund grants. Today, with this webinar, the National Technical Assistance to Brownfield, the TAB programs, will provide some information and advice on preparing the application. Next slide, please. Our goals for today's webinar are to make sure the attendees hear the special considerations for each type of application, assessment, cleanup, and revolving loan fund. There's hints for writing each section of the narrative ranking criteria, and find out about the available assistance from the TAB providers for grant writing. For those of you not familiar, TAB providers, it's technical assistance to brownfields providers. There are 8 organizations that have agreements with EPA to provide assistance to communities and their brownfield projects. And that's the group that's presenting this today. And a little later, you'll get to meet a representative from each of these organizations, and they can tell you a little about how they're going to help specifically with your community's application for a grant. Being 4 weeks in, we realize also that a lot of you have already started. Some of you might be pretty well into taking care of your grant application, and you might already have some specific questions. As we go through, there's going to be an opportunity to ask some on the way, but also we have some time set aside at the end today for a question and answer session for those of you that are quite a ways into this. Next slide, please. All right, a few basics for our webinar today. If you're having any technical difficulties with connectivity or just seeing or hearing this thing, get a hold of Devin Rainwater, and her email address is there on the screen. It's devin.rainwater@cclr.org. And then also want you to know this is being recorded. You might have heard the message, and we're going to post that recording after this is over. Should be available early next week for everybody to see. Next slide, please. All right, if you're using a phone for your audio and your computer for video, please make sure the audio is turned off. That'll help reduce any feedback, and that actually can get in the system for other people too. So we'd appreciate if you do that. Also, everyone except the speakers will be muted during this presentation. We do want you to ask questions though, so use the Zoom chat box. Representatives from the TAB providers will monitor the chat and will either answer the questions right there or forward them to the speakers. And again, there'll be a time at the end to ask additional questions. Also, we have everybody's video turned off, and that's to help with possible bandwidth issues and also to minimize distractions. Next slide, please. All right, today's presenters. For the main part of this, we have Sean Vroom from the New Jersey Institute of Technology, Joelle Greenland with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and myself, Scott Nightingale. I'm with Kansas State University TAB program. Before we get started, we're going to take a few polls, get an idea of kind of what our audience, is looking at for different types of assessments and where you're all from. So Devin, if you could go ahead and launch that first poll, please. This is about which region you live in, EPA. Try to get a feel for where everybody's from. All right, let's go ahead and end that and see what the results are. All right, looks like we got a little bit of distribution here. Lacking a little in regions 1 and 10, but I'm sure people will still be joining. And this kind of goes to show, there's going to be applications for these grants from all over the country. And so try to remember that, you're competing against folks from everywhere. And that's good because there sure are brownfields everywhere. So Devin, if we have the next poll, please. All right, here we're kind of trying to get a feel for your organization type. Private, local government, states, tribal, nonprofits. Okay, thank you. Quite a few local governments, state governments, tribal participation. That's always good to see. The other has me curious. Consultants, that's great. You know, a lot of communities will hire consultants to help with these. That is fantastic. You know, either way, whether you're doing it on your own or you have a consultant, it's good to get as much information as possible. So we're glad you're here. Let's have the next poll, please. All right, and here is a set of questions. There's actually two of them, so scroll down and get them both taken care of. And it's the grant type you're going to apply for, and a little bit about your experience and whether this is a first-time thing for you. Okay, thank you. And not surprisingly, a lot of folks are you know, going for those community-wide assessment grants. That is the most common one we see, and there'll definitely be some information on that today for you. So thank you all for participating in those. And at this point, we'll get started with the content. So next slide, please. And we're going to start by going through some of the considerations for your grant application for each of the different types of application that there are: assessment, cleanup, and revolving loan fund. And to start us off on that, will be Sean Vroom talking about the assessments. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Scott. And good afternoon, everyone. Again, good morning to anyone joining us from the West Coast. As Scott mentioned, my name is Sean Vroom, and I am with the New Jersey Institute of Technology's TAB program. And I'm going to cover EPA's Brownfield assessment grants. And I'm going to focus primarily on the highlights of the grants. As you know, EPA's already done a number of webinars focused on the details, so I don't want to get down too far into the weeds with it, you know, of each one of the grants. So you can always view those recorded webinars as a reference should you need to. So EPA is offering 3 types of assessment grants this solicitation cycle. There's the regular community-wide grants. There's the site-specific grants, and there's the new state and tribal community-wide grants. Eligible activities for all 3 of these grants include Brownfields inventory, site characterization and assessment, which is basically your phase 1 and phase 2s, revitalization planning work, site-specific cleanup and reuse planning, and community involvement activities. So keep in mind that regardless of which type of assessment grant you apply for, a portion of the funding must be used to conduct site assessments, and applications that include more than 60% site assessment activities will be looked upon favorably by EPA. Coalition assessment grants are not offered this solicitation. Just want to make that note so everybody's on board with that. So the first one up here is your community-wide. You can assessment grant, and you can request up to $500,000 for that grant. It's got a 3-year performance period. These types of grants are appropriate when a specific site is not identified, and the applicant plans to spend grant funds on more than one brownfield site in its community. The next type of grant is the assessment grant is the site specific. You can request up to $200,000 or up to $350,000 with a waiver, as long as you can justify why that waiver is required. Similar to the community-wide, it's a 3-year performance period. And these types of grants are appropriate when a specific site is identified and the applicant plans to spend grant funds on this one site only. And then the new grant this year is, or type of assessment grant this year, is the community-wide for states and tribes. This one's up to $2 million you can request in funding. It's a 5-year performance period. And these types of grants are only available to state agencies, tribes, and eligible native corporations in Alaska. So an applicant must plan to use these grant funds to assess a minimum of 10 brownfield sites in disadvantaged communities throughout its jurisdiction. And I want you to keep in mind for all 3 of these grants that you shouldn't ask for more than what you reasonably need to carry out the tasks that you included in your application. So keep that in mind when you're putting together your cost estimates. Next slide, please. So EPA anticipates awarding approximately 83 community-wide and site-specific assessment grants and 9 state and tribal community-wide assessment grants this solicitation cycle. Next slide, please. So this, what I have on this slide is basically the breakout for the scoring. Your regular community-wide assessment and site-specific grants will get you a total of 160 points. And the community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes, a total of 175 points. You can see from the breakout what sections have an additional 5 points on them. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to highlight some of the particulars that include all the assessment grants that are available to solicitation. First up is that only 1 application per state, tribal, or city government. EPA considers departments of the same state, tribal, or city governments to be the same applicant unless they report to a different elected executive. So even if they have different unique entity identifiers, such as your DUNS number, it's going to be considered as one entity. So if your grants, if 2 grants are received from the same entity, EPA is going to flag them at the threshold criteria stage, and they're going to ask the applicant which one they would like to proceed with through the narrative evaluation process. Applicants must decide between either site-specific and community-wide assessments or the state and tribal community-wide assessment. So if you decide that you want to apply for the state and tribe community-wide, it excludes you from applying for the regular community-wide or site-specific and vice versa. So one thing specific to the community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes is that EPA will accept only 1 assessment grant application per eligible state agency and 1 applicant per tribe. So if EPA does receive more than 1 application per state, regardless of the applications, if they're submitted by different eligible state agencies, EPA will only select the highest ranking application that qualifies for selection. So what they'll do is they'll actually go through the grant, they will score it, and they'll take the highest scoring of the 2 or 3, if that's the case. Entities that are applying for community-wide assessment grant that have flexible local laws to conduct assessments beyond their jurisdictional boundaries can formally partner with other interested parties through a memorandum of agreement. It's somewhat similar to the partnership that that you could use under the assessment coalition model, so that it allow you to expand the community-wide assessment scope of work beyond the applicant's boundaries and to assure site success. Next slide, please. So continuing with some of the highlights of all the grants, administrative costs, that's your direct costs and indirect costs. You're going to be allowed up to 5% of the requested funding. Assessment grants do not require cost share, so keep that in mind. Applicants that do not have an open EPA Brownfields assessment grant or multi-purpose grant must affirm that they do not have an active grant. Anybody who has a previously awarded community-wide or site-specific grant, as well as multi-purpose grants, must meet the 70% drawdown. So then that means that if you have an open assessment grant or multi-purpose grant, you should have spent 70% of that awarded grant funding by October 1st of this year. Next slide, please. So on to some of the specifics of the new community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes. Eligible entities for this grant include states, Indian tribes other than in Alaska, including intertribal consortia comprised of eligible Indian tribes, Alaska Native Regional Corporation, Alaska Native Village Corporation, and Metlakatla Indian Community. I should note that colleges and universities are not eligible to apply for this grant. Some of the grant highlights are that you have to identify at least 3 target areas and at least 5 priority sites in the application, and you have to have at least 1 priority site in each target area. EPA will look favorably upon applicants that include a mix of metro and non-metro disadvantaged communities and communities that lack capacity to apply for and manage a grant in their application. You will only, if you apply for this grant, you're only going to be competing against other state and tribal assessment grant applicants for funding. So keep that in mind. As I mentioned earlier, recipients must assess a minimum of 10 sites throughout the 5-year performance period. The application should seek to target disadvantaged communities and communities that lack the capacity to apply for and manage an EPA grant. These grants, contrary to the other 2 assessment grant types, are not subject to the 70% drawdown requirement. And the applications are a 12-page narrative limit, so it gives you 2 extra pages to address some of the additional information requested by EPA. So that covers assessment grants. So I'll turn it now over to Joelle of CClear.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. I'm going to just turn on my video just a little just to say hello to everyone and to welcome you to the webinar. Like Sean said, I'm Joelle Greenland. I'm a senior program consultant with CClear, and I am very excited to be talking to you about these grants and also tips later on in the video. So without further ado, let's get into the cleanup grants and the RLF. So cleanup grant applications. So if assessments, you've done them and now you're ready to clean up. So cleanup grant applications, there's $13 million in this funding round. And here are the activities that you can do with cleanup funds. Note that this is the only grant that you must do a community notification. So that is a threshold criteria. So please be well aware of that criteria. Also, take note of some of these things that often get overlooked with cleanup funds. Environmental insurance, I've used that with a developer that was, it was a game changer actually. And they're, going out of the typical cleanup activities and involving some of these other eligible activities can, make you different than everybody else, right? It just goes the extra mile. And I just want to say that these points are so close. You want to constantly be thinking when you're writing, how does my project differ from any other applicant that is going in? It is literally a horse race with the noses going over the line. So how can you get your horse's nose, if you will, right over that line? That's how competitive and close all these applications are. So I just wanted to mention that. Environmental insurance, basically, it fills the insurance gap created by pollution exclusions in liability and property insurance policies. So that is just one that is a little eclectic, but certainly should not be overlooked. Next slide. So let's get into who is eligible. So all these entities are eligible, government, quasi-government. You can see the full list in section 3A. The funding availability, as I said, is 13 million. So basically, if you have a single site, you can, just like Sean said, only ask for what you need and what you can actually show, as we will go over in the narratives, that you have, that is reasonable and feasible implementation, right? That probably came out very wrong, but you got to show that you can use it and that you're not just throwing a number out in the air, right? Okay. And if you only have one site, you can actually ask for that waiver of up to 650,000. But be careful with this one, not to dissuade anyone, but these are, as the guidelines say, they are approved on a very extremely limited basis. So just be careful about that, okay? But if you can provide the justification, then go for it. Multi-sites, again, up to 500,000 per application, and applicants may submit just one application. Okay, there is a cost share requirement. It's 20%. However, the cost share can be in the form of money, labor, materials. So don't let that dissuade you from going after a cleanup grant either. Period of performance is 3 years, and anticipated number of awards is 26. However, if you divide 26 into that 13 million, you do get 500,000. So if somebody's asking for less, then there may be more awards. And if somebody is asking for 650 and they did a great application, then there might be less awards. Okay, or less money. Next slide. The revolving loan fund. I personally love revolving loan funds. I had the pleasure and honor of actually overseeing a revolving loan fund and securing funds for a revolving loan fund. I only saw that 3% of you on this call are actually going after a revolving loan fund, but I wish you all the best. These are amazing grants. They are loans and they're sub-grants. There is a percentage, I think it's now 50-50 with loans and sub-grants. They're basically the same as a cleanup grant, right? But more, because once those funds that you have loaned revolve back, that's called program income, and that program income basically revolves and keeps revolving, and you can use it for assessment and cleanup. So keep in mind though, only entities without an open RLF cooperative agreement are eligible to apply. So those who do already have one, supplemental funding is anticipated to be announced in February of 2022. I also want to mention that you can only apply for either a cleanup grant or a revolving loan fund, okay? Keep in mind with revolving loan funds, you really have to show they're designed to operate for many years. It is a heavy administrative, I don't want to say burden, but it is a lot to carry. But you need to have and show that you understand real estate financing principles and approaches, loan underwriting, loan servicing, credit analysis, and that you can actually, go the long haul, if you will. Long-term resource commitments and reporting even after the RLF is closed. Why? Because they want to know what you're doing with the program income, right? And that keeps revolving. But if you have assessment grants and you have a revolving loan fund, you basically have a one-stop shop. And that makes your community and your organization very attractive for developers and investors, because they realize that not only can you assess, but you can also clean up. Okay, next slide. So eligibility, we went over that. and then up to $1 million. It is a lot of money. Back when I managed one, it was a 60-40 split. So you had to loan 60% and 40% you could sub-grant out. And so basically you set up the terms, right? The RLF, you can also have an RLF coalition, more resources, more people to help. There is a cost share requirement, and we've talked about that. The period of performance is 5 years. However, when you think about that program income revolving back, the period of performance is talking about the actual grant and the closing of the grant, but the program income keeps going if you've set it up that way. They've anticipated the number of awards is 8. So I highly recommend really thinking about revolving loan funds. It is a big commitment, but when I took it over, I knew nothing about it and figured it out. And it is truly one of my favorite programs. So I encourage everyone to really think about revolving loan funds if they have that capability. And I believe I'm going to turn it back over to Scott.
Thank you, Joelle. Next slide, please. We're going to get into some specifics later about the different narrative criteria, hints for writing that, but I'm going to talk for a little bit here about just some general writing hints for the whole application, beginning with threshold criteria. Now, one thing to point out, your tab providers, we are here to help you. We're going to do what we can to help with your applications. We are not the folks to ask threshold criteria and eligibility questions to. Those need to go to EPA. In each of the guidelines, the assessment cleanup and RLF, in section 7, there is a list of your contacts at EPA. They can help you with that. While they're restricted on what they can do to advise you on content of application, for threshold, those are your resources. Some folks, and it's really sad, there have been people that had excellent applications but messed up one thing on the threshold. And they're out. I mean, it's pass fail. It's not that you get docked points. If you screw that up, your application is void and it doesn't matter. With that said, that we aren't the ones that help you with that, I do want to point out one thing that's new this year, and that is the named contractors and subrecipients portion that has been added to the threshold criteria. And what that does is if you're going to actually name in your application, you're going to tell who the contractor and subrecipients are, you are going to have to show that they have been procured through proper methods. And I put the quote in there because I think it's somewhat important. EPA does not require or encourage applicants to name procurement contractors. They're not asking you to do it. I'm not sure they even want you to do it. You can if you want, but there's a lot of extra hurdles. And if you do decide to do it, just really take the time to make sure that you've provided the information they need to make that okay. Next slide, please. In the narrative information sheet, we'll talk a little bit about this. It's in the guidelines. Specifically, do not include a summary or overview of your narrative project. And not only that, during last week's EPA webinars, I think they said that 3 or 4 times. This is not the place. A lot of people, think, oh, this is like the summary letter of my project. I'll give just the overview. That's not what they want. It's just something extra. They're not going to care about it. If you put something in there, it's not going to count towards anything. You only get a few pages, so use that space to actually answer the questions they're asking. Part of the narrative information sheet is the other factors. Now, other factors are things that they're not part of the score that you're going to receive for your application, but they are going to be considered in tie-break situations. As Joelle pointed out, this is very competitive, and it's almost always comes down to a few tiebreakers, and the other factors is one of those things they look at. So take a look at them. There's some changes this year. They've asked to identify any target areas in a community where a coal-fired power plant has recently closed or is closing. And then also to make sure and mention if your target area is in or includes a census tract with greater 20% of the population living below the national poverty level. So those are new things. Also new in the narrative information sheet this year, there is a releasing copies of applications. You know, in the past, to get copies of previous successful or unsuccessful applications, you would have to do a FOIA request or visit a website such as ours where we did a FOIA request and we have these documents. Going forward, EPA is actually going to put these on their website. So I want you to consider this when you're identifying your sites and talking about the community groups you're going to be working with. The information was always public, but now it's even more public. So, you know, make sure that you're comfortable with everybody in your community seeing that you've identified it as a priority site. You know, if you list a community group, sometimes people in the past have done that speculatively, you know, like, oh, well, if we get a grant, we'll contact them. Might want to make sure they're on board before you put them out there for everybody to see that you're saying that you're going to work with them. So just consider that in the narrative information sheet this year. Next slide. All right, throughout your application, there are several places in the guidelines where EPA suggests something, they recommend something. Follow those suggestions, even if it's not required. This year, applicants are encouraged to include data from EPA's EJ Screen tool. They don't say it's a requirement. They allow you to bring in data from other sources. They will like to see if you use the tool that they're suggesting. That also goes with the sample tables. You know, they have provided a format on which you can do your budget table. It's recommended, if possible, you use their format. It's easier for them to review. Next, use statistics to tell your story and details. You know, it always sounds a lot better if you actually have some numbers and some detail on things, you know, not just, oh, there's been a decrease in jobs in our area. It's like, you know, in the last 3 years, due to these economic factors, we have lost 18% of our full-time jobs in that community. If you have numbers to back things up, that is looked at favorably. Also, details are, well, when we participate in the debriefs between EPA and applicants that are not successful, almost always there is a comment that if there's a section where points were taken off, there wasn't enough detail. They're looking for specifics to tell your story. Another thing to remind you of, carefully edit. You know, you want this to be as easy to read for the reviewer as possible. Spelling, grammar, take the time, make it right if you can. And then one last thing, don't use a bunch of acronyms that you haven't identified what they are. And also remember that there will be at least one person on the panel scoring your application that's not from your area. You know, you might be in Knoxville and you're going to partner with the Tennessee Valley Authority's Economic Development Program. But if you just start talking about the TVA and what all you're going to do with them, it's possible somebody reviewing in California doesn't know what the TVA is. So make sure you explain your acronyms, explain the things that are local so everybody will understand. All right. Now we'll get to more of the specific writing, and that'll be Sean again. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks again, Scott. So I'm going to cover, I'm going to go through the first two. There's basically 4 major sections to the applications for all 3 available grants. So I'm going to talk about the first 2, kind of go through the highlights, some of the more common mistakes. And I think that, you know, this is the part where you really, these 2 parts are where you set the stage, you establish your community's need. And you know, the grants really, all the grants applications that come in have to be a compelling story. And you have to emphasize the uniqueness of your project, because I mean, as we say, ordinary doesn't get funded. So, you know, as Joelle and Scott both mentioned, the cutoff and the closeness of who gets funded and who doesn't is very slim margin. So what you need to think about going into these sections is you want to paint and this is very hard for a lot of people to do, is paint your community in the most impoverished light possible. You want to leave them crying in the aisles, kind of an approach. So the first section here is major section is project area description and plans for revitalization. The first section under this heading is target area and brownfields, background and description of your target area. So in this section, you want to clearly define your target area or areas. Don't just say, oh yeah, it's on the west side of town, or, if you can give bounds, do so. Be as specific as possible, and keep in mind that the reviewers of your grant application may not be familiar with your focus or target area at all. So you really need to paint that picture for them so they get a feel for those target areas. For a community-wide assessment application for states and tribes, you want to have at least 3 specific target areas, at least 1 in a metropolitan statistical area, and at least 1 in a non-metropolitan statistical area. You want to have a focus area that makes geographical sense. And that's, that's actually applicable for, the need for cleanup and redevelopment. That's what you want to establish here. You want to include your identified brownfield sites. I've seen grant applications come in where they actually used a highlighted brownfield site that wasn't within their target area. So make sure that they are within your target area. You want to make sure that the focus areas that you select supports the challenges and the goals of your application. You want to make sure that it includes sensitive or vulnerable populations. You want to make sure that there's relevant plans in that focus area that you can bring to bear in your application, and what their relevance is on your project. Existing or planned investments, you want to have a good handle on what investments have occurred in the area. Has there been upgrades in your utilities in the area, transportation access, any pedestrian amenities that have been included? So you want to make sure that you include all of that information in the application. For regular and supersized community-wide, this does exclude tribes though, because all those areas are considered to be in the Justice 40, meet the Justice 40 goals for areas that have undue a burden on them. So the target area is smaller than a city or municipality. You want to list the census tracts within your target areas. Next slide, please. So the description of your brownfields sites so here you really want to give as much information on the sites that you highlight in your application. For assessment grants, you want to clearly describe the site conditions. Is it abandoned? Is it fenced in and secure? What is the size of the site? What's the zoning? Do you know, what are the environmental conditions on the site? Are there existing structures remaining? Is it just the building slabs? Is it overgrown? What kind of infrastructure is at the site, and what kind of access does the site have? Is it next to a waterway? Does it have rail? Is there good access to a larger highway system? For cleanup grants, you want to clearly describe the information that you have on the known contamination. You want to discuss the degree of severity of the conditions. Again, similar to the other grant, the assessment grants, you want to make sure that site conditions are included. So, does it have structures on it, wetlands, floodplain, et cetera, and what relevant past and current land issues affect the site. Just to highlight what I mentioned earlier for the assessment grants, you need to do a minimum of 5 sites for the state and tribal assessment grants. Next slide, please. So for the revitalization of the target area section, reuse strategy and alignment with revitalization plans, you want to clearly define your reuse strategy here. You want to identify existing plans for the area. Again, those that have relevance to your projects and your focus area. or target area? Are your project goals consistent with those plans? And do those existing plans support that wider vision? And if not, do they need to be either updated, or do you need to do some more work in that area? As far as outcomes and benefits of your reuse strategy, you want to think about things such as affordable housing units, commercial space that you're going to create, how many square feet, number of anticipated jobs that may be created from the redevelopment of the site. How many acres of open space will you be creating, economic benefits, renewable energy potential on the site, and benefits to environmental justice communities if that's applicable to your site and focus area. Next slide, please. So in the strategy for leveraging resources section, this resources needed for site reuse, you want to describe your eligibility for funding. You want to make sure that you put that statement in that you're eligible for these reasons for these funds. You want to identify your funding resources, but you want to make sure that in this section that you don't duplicate sources that you're going to reference in section 3A, which is a description of task activities and outputs. And this would be applicable to all 3 grant types. And so you don't want to duplicate sources that you would use to meet your cost share for the RLF and the cleanup. You want to discuss potential leverage funding sources. You want to discuss when and how identified resources will be applied so that it shows that you have a good understanding of the overall plan and redevelopment plan and project plan. And you want to be clear on committed versus anticipated funding. Next slide, please. So use of existing infrastructure. So in this section, you basically, all you want to do is list what existing infrastructure is relevant to your site. So that would be water, sewer, gas, electric. What kind of transportation access is there? Do you have high-speed internet, things of that nature? And you want to talk about how that infrastructure fits into your redevelopment plan. You also want to list what infrastructure you will need to either have put in or upgrades to the existing to meet the project goals. Next slide, please. Okay, section 2 of the grant application narrative section. So the first section in subsection in this section is community needs. So under the community's need for funding, you want to list the factors that are going to impact the community's ability to fund the project. You want to discuss the loss of tax base in your target area. You want to highlight if you have a small population that would struggle to fund the project or the project that you're proposing. You want to talk about the lack of investment in the area because these areas are blighted and the impact of the brownfields that this investment, because of that lack of investment that you cannot fund this project. You want to talk about unemployment. You want to talk about low median income of the population of your target area. And to the greatest extent possible, you want to quantify your impact, those impacts, and you want to reinforce your community challenges. So, and for state and tribal assessments, you're going to be evaluated on the extent to which this funding will serve communities that do not have the capacity to apply for and manage their own brownfields grant and would otherwise not have access to brownfield grant resources to address brownfield sites. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a write-up from a successful past grant application. You can read it while I'm talking a little bit, but basically what I want you to get out of this is, as you read through this, they make the case for why they need the funding, why they can't fund this project, and they do quantify it as much as practical. So I'll give you just a couple seconds more to take a look at it. Next slide, please. So on to the next section, which is threats to sensitive populations. So the health or welfare of sensitive populations, what you want to do for this section is, think about for health issues. You want to think about those that are impacting your sensitive populations. sensitive populations being EJ communities, the elderly, children, pregnant women, things of that nature. The availability of health department statistics. You want to think about the potential for contamination pathways from those sites that you highlight in your application. For welfare issues, you want to think about social negatives such as crime, vandalism, illegal dumping, people moving out of the area, so loss of population, abandoned properties. You want to think about community disinvestment. You want to think about burden on municipal services. And don't forget that not only do you need to list this, you need to describe how this grant's going to address or facilitate the identification and reduction of threats to the health or welfare of such groups. And again, as Scott mentioned earlier, as much as you possibly can, if you can use the EPA's EJ screening tool and Enviro Atlas to establish those communities' characteristics, we recommend that you do so. Next slide, please. So under threats to sensitive populations, here you want to address your greater than normal incidence of disease and adverse health conditions. You want to discuss the potential contaminants that may be connected to your sites. You want to discuss the potential health threats that may affect your community, such as cancer rates, asthma rates, birth defect rates, lead levels, obesity, and other health data that fits your overall story. Next slide, please. So just actually, can you go back one slide? Thanks. So here, if possible, I know you want to link potential contaminants and health issues, and you want to discuss exposure pathways, like I said, but sometimes it can be difficult to identify those hard connections between your sites, the potential contaminants on them, and your target area population and the disease that they suffer from. But, you can reasonably assume given the contaminants that may be on a site and the resulting disease that they may cause, you can reasonably assume that there is somehow a connection and a pathway to that community. So, keep in mind, it can be a little bit of a difficult criteria to kind of meet here. So, don't get too hung up on this section. If the information is there, include it, but don't worry too much if you can't necessarily hit it out of the park as far as connections. Next slide, please. So continuing here this is basically want to talk about, where do you get the data to support your claims of greater than normal incidence of disease and adverse health conditions. So your basic or typical sources are, your local health department. You can go to the National Center for Environmental Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. You can use the U.S. Department of Labor or Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau, but you also might think looking outside the box or thinking outside the box a little bit. Do you have an area hospital that may have some admission data for asthma? Do you have an urgent care clinic that may have some health data similar to that, that you might consider that supports your story? So projects, and again, projects that address a greater than normal incidence of cancer, asthma, or birth defects will be evaluated more favorably by EPA for this section. Next slide, please. So this is the new section under the guidelines. This used to be basically like cumulative environmental impacts. Now it's promoting environmental justice. In this section, you want to identify environmental justice communities in the target areas. You want to discuss how the outcomes of the project are going to promote environmental justice. Next slide, please. So basically here, this kind of tells you what's considered, an EJ community. So you define a community by either a group of individuals living in geographic proximity to one another or geographically dispersed set of individuals. So that may be migrant workers or Native Americans, where either type of group experiences common conditions. So when you're defining disadvantage, you want to think about things, income, persistent poverty, unemployment, underemployment, racial and ethnic residential segregation, linguistic isolation, substandard housing, transportation access, distressed neighborhoods, disproportionate environmental stressor burden and high cumulative impacts. You want to consider limited water and sanitation access and affordability, disproportionate impacts from climate change, low energy access, jobs lost through the energy transition, access to healthcare, and geographic areas within tribal jurisdictions. And again, some of the resources for this data can be found Justice 40, EPA EJ Screen Tool, and Enviro Atlas. Next slide, please. So project involvement. In this section, you're going to identify organizations, entities, groups that are going to be involved and provide assistance or support the project. So typically, the usual suspects for this may be neighborhood groups, bankers and lenders, business owners, environmental justice organizations, nonprofits, property owners, lenders, developers, real estate development professionals. But sometimes you need to go beyond the usual suspects. So you might consider faith-based organizations. They can be extremely helpful in reaching out to the community for community engagement tasks. Arts and culture community. They can be useful in coming up with suggesting creative reuses for certain properties. They can also be very useful in coming up with a creative way to market your brownfield site. And you may also consider the medical community. So specific to community-wide assessment grant applications for states and tribes, they'll be evaluated on the extent to which the application has a sound plan to identify and engage local organizations, entities, groups to be involved in the project as additional target areas and priority sites are identified throughout the period of performance. Next slide, please. So under community engagement, we have project roles for those that you identify as stakeholders and partners. So, you want to discuss here how they're going to be involved in the site selection, prioritization, cleanup, and future redevelopment of the project. And this is much more than just support. It's meaningful involvement in the project. It's not about, how many you identify as participant or stakeholders or partners. It's about the quality of what you want and what they're going to bring to the project. So, examples of that would be that they're going to participate on the cleanup project committee. They're going to talk to their constituency about the project. They're going to host public meetings, provide technical assistance, so on and so forth. And again, as Scott mentioned, if you can put these, tables are great. It's especially applicable to this section. It saves you space, and it's very easy for your EPA reviewer to get a feel for who's involved in this project and what their role is going to be. And like I said, it's easier for them, and a happy reviewer is a generous reviewer. So you don't want to make this any more difficult than you have to for the reviewer, because then they may get cranky because they're on their 30th review and you wouldn't get the maximum points for this section. Next slide, please. So for your community engagement, you have to have a good community engagement plan. You want to make sure that it's appropriate for your targeted community. Communities are made up of all, can vary. No one size fits all. Communities can have different income levels, ethnicities, language, and so you want to make sure that you have an effective way to both consider and respond to the community input. And this has actually been an area where a lot of applicants, they miss it here. You want to make sure that you're going to meaningfully incorporate that input that you garner from the community. You don't want to go and do your community engagement just to say you did it. You want to make sure that they feel that they're part of the process, give them a little bit of ownership, and let them feel that the ultimate redevelopment, that they had a hand in getting to that goal. You're also going to have to, for your engagement plan, you're going to have to address how you're going to, excuse me, accommodate social distancing as a result of COVID-19. So for this, you might think about, the capacity of the community. What are the immediate needs? You might have to prioritize things until maybe the social distancing loosens up. Virtual engagement, again, you want to make sure that your community has access to the internet. You want to maybe think analog in your approach, and you might do outdoor meetings. So you might have to get a little bit creative to address those restrictions. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the end of section 2. And what I'll do now is hand it over to Joelle.
Thanks, Sean. All right, everybody take 3 big breaths because that was a lot to digest, right? Sean, awesome job. Okay, so now we get to task description, cost estimates, and measuring progress. There are 3 things that you're addressing here. Let's talk about points, okay? We have discussed how this is a horse race, right? At least I have. With the nose, it is winning by a nose, right? By 1 point. So when you look at the points here, between assessments, cleanup, RLF, the one thing that is constant is that this section actually stayed the same, or in most cases went down. So yes, community-wide states and tribes is a new assessment, but for whatever reason in the guidelines, EPA showed it actually went down. So we'll let that pass. But the takeaway is that where are the points going? Well, they're going into programmatic capabilities and community need and community engagement. So really pay attention. Yes, is project area description and plan for revitalization, is that important? Sure. But is it as important as programmatic capabilities and community need and community engagement? So the answer is no, right? Everything's important, but really pay attention to when EPA is basically saying the words will look favorably or will not look favorably, okay? So each one of these percentages may not sound like a lot, but they correlate to about 4.8 points in each of those sections, okay? So let's get into the task descriptions first. Next slide. Okay. There are 5 things you need to make sure that you are absolutely addressing and in the most visually and most efficient saving of space, right? You have page limits, so you need to be aware of that. Tasks are talking about what are you doing, right? Is it program management? Is it operations? Is it cleanup, community outreach? What is it, right? Implementation is the how. How are you going to do it? Make sure you are using action verbs. Like Sean said, they may be on their 33rd review, right? You want to engage and keep them engaged and show them that you are really, really have a plan for implementation. The schedule. By when? Not, yep, we will do 10 community meetings. Not good enough. When are you going to do them? Lead. Who is doing it, right? It's not just staff will do, right? You can already see where the issues are, or if they're doing things together, showing that collaboration. Outputs. We'll talk about outputs and outcomes later, but outputs are talking about metrics, right? What are the things that are going to be done as far as, in an RLF, you're going to execute a memorandum of agreement, right? Or maybe a underwriter and appraisal contracts, right? Community implementation plan, right? So these are outputs, and that's when you're speaking the lingo, it shows the reader that you are very aware of the guidelines. You are aware of the reporting requirements under these grants, right? Because you're going to have a cooperative agreement, and then you're going to have to do a work plan. By speaking the lingo now, you are automatically showing them that you understand what you're getting yourself into, okay? And if you don't understand any of this lingo that we've been showing you in these slides, then take a step back and see if you're ready for one of these grants. I really, really can't stress that enough. Next slide. Let's look at how this actually, this is from a successful grant that basically, instead of doing, sentences and sentences and sentence, right? They did a really clever chart format that is so easy on the eyes to read, right? What is it? You're doing grant management, community outreach. I can see the tasks easily. 1, 2, who's the lead? Implementation, what's the schedule? What's the outputs? It is so neatly done and has utilized the space so efficiently that it shows me that this person knows how to write, 1, a grant, but 2, knows what's going to be required of them under just this one topic, okay? And then next slide, I think we're going to go into cost estimates. Yep, okay. So that was task descriptions. So I can't stress, you may think, oh, it's no big deal. Yeah, every section is a big deal, because if you lose a point, that means somebody else had a chance to gain that point over you, okay? Cost estimates. With assessments, please watch admin costs. EPA says allocating at least 60% of funds to site-specific work, site-specific cleanup planning, will be evaluated more favorably. Wink, wink, okay? Be really in tune when things are underlined and they say more favorably, right? Same thing with community-wide assessment, state and tribes. Cost estimates that are not reasonable or realistic to implement will be evaluated less favorably, right? Wink, wink. So make sure that when you're putting, at least for me, when I've written these, I don't think I've ever put anything down in personnel. That's not to say that grants haven't been awarded that do have personnel costs, okay? Just make sure that you have a strong justification of why you're putting personnel costs down, okay? All right, so cost estimates. Estimates for each task, right? The how. So you're marrying the two, the tasks to the work, to the cost estimates. When you're doing this, when and if you get a grant, you're going to have to do a work plan. And if you figure this out here in the grant now, then that work plan is a lot easier to do, right? So you can present things, if it's appropriate, in costs and unit per cost and cost per unit, right? Be specific. Sean and Scott, we can't say this enough. You have to be specific, not $500 for supplies. Why? For what? What are you doing with those supplies? Travel. Where are you going? Well, we're going to go to the National Brownfields Conference, or we're going to go to our state conference. And who's going to go, right? And for what purpose? To keep our knowledge, relevant into, whatever that is, right? Again, realistic and implementable. Very important. Can't say that enough, honestly. Correlation to tasks, absolutely. All these, we can say that each one of these things that we're saying is so important, but you've got to be marrying your task to cost estimates and then how you're going to be measuring. It all comes together, okay? So let's go on to that measuring progress. Next slide. Actually, I think we might have an example. Yes, we do. Okay, so in this example, again, this is from that same grant. And what they did was, at the very beginning, I love this, right before their table, they say, the overall budget is summarized in the following table. 89% of funding is allocated right out the bat, right? The reader doesn't even need to do the math. They're anticipating this, right? They're saying, look, 89% of funding is allocated towards phase 1 and 2. Awesome, right? Okay, and no direct or other costs are requested, right? So that really sounds great. Okay, and then this budget is matching up to the tasks that were already outlined and the totals. Make sure, guys, that when you're using tables, that they read properly, both horizontally and vertically. Nothing drives anybody creative than myself, but a reviewer when your tables do not line up. Like you've put in your cost share in there, or you've put in other numbers, but they don't read horizontally as well as vertically. Okay. Again, there is no room for error. And if you make them look pretty, they show that way when you're reviewing. Okay. Now I think we're going to get into measuring progress. Next slide. No, we're not. I lied again. Okay, so the cost estimates, now I know. Okay, so we're marrying this again, right? So from the very beginning, you outlined your tasks. Then you outlined the budget. And then this table now provides a summary of the estimated costs, right? So this one, again, was a winning grant. And what they did is, yes, you saw the budgets, yes, you saw the tasks, and we're now going to break that down for you. So if you take travel costs, $12,000, okay, for 4 coalition members to attend 2 Brownfield conferences, right? They're estimated at this per person, remember that cost per unit, right? Based on recent conference costs. Great. That's where their source is coming from, right? Approximately for airfare, hotel, incidentals, registry, right? They're breaking it down, and they've done it in 3 lines. Again, 3 lines again with the community engagement, a little bit more for the task 3, but they're going over and over again, using bold to give more weight, obviously, for the eyes to get to the total budget and making sure everything ties together, right? So this is a great example. Okay, next slide. Now we're getting into measuring progress. Okay, so cost estimates are key, and they'll also be your best friend to, if you put the effort into it now with your work plan later when you get the grant. We're going to be positive here, right? Okay, measuring progress. Metrics. Okay, can't say this enough. Measuring progress. How are you going to track whether or not all the things that you said you were doing were actually happening and that you're being successful, right? So you want to make sure that you're tracking, you're showing them how you are tracking, measuring, and evaluating, right? So here are some of the ways you can do it. You're going to, and again, remember when I talked about as you're writing the grant, you're using the Brownfields lingo, right? Especially the reporting requirements. So if you're telling them about quarterly and annual reports, you're telling them that you understand that you're going to have to do quarterly reports, that you will have to do the annual reports, right? Those MeeBee-Weebee reports, the SF 425, if you want to drop in that Code of Federal Regulations 2 CFR 200, right? Super circular. Knowing and saying that language in your grant shows the reader that you know and you're familiar with reporting requirements and how to measure progress. Okay. Next slide. So here is an example of a winning grant again that showed measuring how they were going to measure the environmental results, right? So here they talk about outputs and short and long-term outcomes, okay? So outputs, be very careful that you understand the difference between outputs and outcomes. And outcomes are measured in the EPA database acres, and that's very important to EPA. But outputs are things like the number of phase ones, phase twos, you know, how many brownfields that you've identified, and you know, your APGA, right? Then the outcomes is things that are the number of acres, the number of jobs, how much money has been leveraged, right? Private investment, leveraged funding, right? Affordable housing units, right? So those are outcomes. So, you know, you're giving a guess, but the city will continue to update acres, right? Again, the lingo, right? They understand that acres is out there and that they're going to be required to do this. So the more that you can talk the lingo, the better your chances are that, you know, the reader is saying this person knows exactly what they're getting into and that they'll understand the reporting requirements. Okay. All right. We are going to get into the next slide, which is the programmatic capability and past performance. And the next slide, please. Let's talk about this. Programmatic capability, the point percentage distributions have completely changed in all the grant applications except for cleanup. Okay. Those points went higher or increased in the community need and community engagement. So if you're doing a cleanup grant, be aware that the points overall went from 175 to 180 for a maximum number of points with the cleanup grant. And that where it actually is counting the most is community need and community engagement, which increased by 2%. So programmatic capability has increased pretty consistently, though, with all the assessment and in the RLF. So let's get into programmatic capability. Next slide. So with programmatic capability, if at this point, you know, in the grant, they have, the reader has gone through the narratives, right, of what Sean, you know, went over as far as project area description, plan for revitalization, the community need, the community engagement. It sounds awesome. Please do not phone in on programmatic capability. This is where they're wondering who is actually going to be carrying out everything and whether you can do it, right? So it says this is a change, right? And they're really stressing this. Discuss the applicant's organizational capacity for carrying out the programmatic, administrative, and financial requirements of the project and grant, right? So they're really wondering, right? And this is where people lose points. It's not enough to say you have a project manager that's gonna handle the day-to-day operations, okay? You have to be specific, right? In the three areas: programmatic, administrative, and financial. Who's doing what, right? The key staff, how much, right? As far as how much have you handled? You can say, oh yes, we've gotten this many grants and this much money and blah, blah, blah. But you have to know, you have to tell them, how much have you handled? How long, right? So just make sure you're not the lone wolf. You're not portraying yourself as a lone wolf, but you have this amazing team. Okay, next slide. So here's an example, okay? The not so great is on the left, right? County staff has successfully managed blah, 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 right? Okay, in the interest of time, on the right side is the way that you want to be writing, right? Awesome Cities Community Development Department will manage this grant. It is previously managed, boom, right out of the gate. How much? 40 million. How long? In the past 7 years. And by who? Sally Superstar. And she's the Brownfields program manager. That's the person, that's her title. She's serving as the project manager, and she's been with the city for over 18 years, right? Sounds like longevity, sounds like you don't have high turnover, right? And she's going to be assisted by Austin Awesome, community engagement specialist. Oh, and look, there's his background. And he's been with, he's had, with over 15 years of federal grant management experience. Faith, fantastic, right? So now you're talking about the finance manager. And what did I say about the lingo? The 2 CFR 200.317. Show off. This is not a place to be modest, folks. Okay. Show off what you know. Okay. Next slide. So past performance. So be specific, right, to the type of funding being requested. So they even say, this is going to be specific. So past performance, if you're going for an assessment grant or you're going for a revolving loan fund or a cleanup, you're going to talk about what your past performance to those types of grants is relevant and applicable, right? Again, I've already told you, don't be modest, okay? Just like Sean said, where you want to show the poverty and what's going on in your community to show that they really need this money, right? Here, don't be modest about what you've done in the past and how you have actually spent money, moved money, and utilized it, right? The funding sources, because they say if you've never gotten a Brownfield grant before, tell us about what other grants you've managed, okay? Federal grants. If you have never handled a federal grant, tell them how you're gonna do it. Local grants, right? You've got the dream team, okay? And whether or not you've leveraged resources, right? The compliance record. This is tantamount, right? Show that you're competent and that you know that you're going to manage it even if you have to pivot if something goes wrong. So I'm going to give you a last example. Next slide. Okay, obviously again, on the left is okay, right? And on the right is better, okay? Time frame, right? The city presently has or had EPA Brownfield grants. Now you're being more specific on the right side, since 1988, right? So you get the idea. The more specific you are that you can outline and that you can show outputs and outcomes and what you've done with what money and who is doing it, right? The better off you're going to be, all right? I can't stress programmatic capability section enough, as it has increased with all the grants. With that said, I'm going to hand it back off to Scott.
All right, thank you very much, Joelle. A lot of information there. You and Sean really put a lot in on that. There's a lot to know, and that's one of the reasons there are TAB programs, is to help communities out with that. That's what we're here for. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the resources that we have now. Next slide, please. Three things in particular I want to point out. Examples of previous successful grant applications. There's also a grant writing software tool called TabEZ we're going to hit on a little. And then we're going to talk about each individual TAB provider's ability to provide some review of your grant applications. Next slide, please. All right. Past successful grants are so nice to look at. On the KSU TAB website, we have a collection of those. It's pretty easy to get to, ksutab.org. Across the top ribbon, hit resources, and then you can click in the categories box. The first thing that comes up there is the list of previous successful grant applications and proposals. And you can pick by year, you can pick by what type, application, RLF, you get a grant application that's for cleanup, whatever you want to see. Now, these things are awful handy. Say you're struggling, you should show some leveraged funds, but you don't have any ideas. Pull up some examples, see what other people have done. Perhaps it's, you don't have any great ideas of, maybe all the groups in your community that might be involved. You look through a few of these that have been successful, you will see what other people have done. It will give you ideas. And if you're looking for something in particular, say you want to do an asbestos cleanup, As opposed to searching through all of them, you can contact me here at KSU Tab. I can help you find one that's similar to your project. Be happy to do that for you. Next slide, please. All right, I want to talk a little about our Tab EZ grant writing tool. This is also a KSU Tab product. This will not write the grant for you, but it divides the grant writing down into the sections. And so section by section, you can input your information. It's not a one-time thing. You work on it, you just put it aside, you come back. It just provides the framework to organize your application. And with each little section that you write, it combines the narrative ranking criteria along with the scoring stuff from later. It's going to have those as a comparison right there. They're not always identical, so you might want to see the differences. Also, in most sections, there is a helping hints. Even if you don't want to use this tool to help you draft your language, some people just pull it up and use it for the helpful hints. They might be working on community need and, oh, well, let's read the hints. Those hints have been developed over years of hearing EPA suggestions, comments during debriefs for unsuccessful applicants, and other sources of information. We've compiled those. It's just a nice list to go through. Make sure you're getting everything possible in that. It's an easy program to use, menu driven, and if you are stuck somewhere in there in the process, having trouble using it, it's something that KSU Tab staff can help you work through. We're happy to do that. Next slide, please. All right, as I mentioned earlier, there are 6 technical assistance Brownfields providers that have agreements with EPA to provide assistance to you, the communities, for no cost. One of the key services that's provided at this time of the year is we can do reviews of your draft applications. It has been shown in years past, if you have one of the tab providers review your draft, your chances of being successful increase by quite a bit. Part of that is it's just an extra set of eyes that has quite a bit of experience in the field, seen a lot of applications. Part of it is you'll need it to get it to us in time for us to review it and get it back to you. So it gives you kind of an interim deadline, helps you get organized and get things moving quicker. So what we're going to do now is each of the 6 tab providers is going to jump on and share with you their procedures for providing this free application review. And I'm going to turn it over first to Nefeli Bompati with the University of Connecticut.
Hi, everyone. Next slide, please. So we are a new type provider for the communities in Region 1. Besides the proposal review, we'll be also offering a webinar on EJ Screen next Wednesday, October 27th at 1 to 2 p.m. Although, we are providing service to communities in Region 1, we would welcome, any of you to attend that webinar. Essentially, the webinar will be a hands-on exercise on how to use the tool in order to write the demographic section of your grant. So I'll put into the chat the registration form, and again, you're more than welcome to join us. In terms of proposal grant review, we're offering 2 levels of reviews. One is an in-depth review of the proposal with a deadline to send it to us by October 25th. And essentially in this, type of review, we'll be going over your proposals, providing, edits and suggestions with respect to if you meet, the EPA's rubric. And if you don't think that, you can send us the review by October 25th. Then we're also offering another round of reviews with a deadline of November 12th. Where essentially we'll be going over your proposal, providing some feedback on with respect to if you meet EPA's criteria or not. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to Son.
Thank you, Nefeli. So Sean Vroom, NJIT tab. Basically, what we're going to be doing are not high level, we'll be doing in-depth grant reviews or critiques. Our submission deadline for those critiques is November 17th, close of business. We ask that you submit your grant application in Word format, as well as if you've unsuccessfully applied last year and you did receive an EPA debrief, if you could also submit that as well. We'll be providing these reviews to, obviously, to Region 2. But as you move through the process, you don't feel like you can't pick up the phone and call us if you have a question about a section prior to your submission. You know, we can work through a lot of it maybe before it even gets to us for that review. Yeah, my contact information is up here. And again, it isn't, I mean, we always say it's a first come, first served basis, but we never turn anybody away up till that deadline. So, you know, but the sooner you get them in, the better. Again, if I was applying and I was going to ask for a critique, I'd rather be the 5th review and not the 30th. So, so there's our contact information, and I'll turn it now over to KDC, who's with the West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center.
Thanks, Sean. Yes, my name is Katie. I'm here on behalf of the WVU TAB program. We are also a new TAB provider, but we do have a lot of depth and experience with our staff here. So don't let that concern you. We're happy to help you out here in Region 3. Our deadline to submit is November 12th. So we ask that you reach out to us. We're happy to help you with anything you need. But we do ask that, again, the deadline be November 12th. We have similar services, just like those that spoken before us. We've worked with Virginia in preparing an EPA webinar, and we're also currently working with Pennsylvania to prepare a grant writing webinar as well. So I also want to mention that here at WVU, we also partner with our landscape architecture program and also our School of Public Health. So happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you. And I'm going to hand it over to Clark.
All right. Hey, everybody. I saw we have some Region 4 folks here, which is great. So ICMA is the new TAB provider for Region 4. Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama. We are reviewing some proposals for this year. So we also have the 12th of November as a deadline. As early as you can get them to us, the better. And then after this, you know, our ongoing technical assistance is really, we'll have an intake process online soon, but we want to work with everyone from local governments to nonprofit organizations working on development and capacity building within that network of brownfield redevelopment folks in your community to make sure that you are getting things to the next level. Everything from Brownfields 101 to much more advanced hands-on exercises, engagement, and strategy. So, and we have a list of subject matter experts from engineering to nonprofits and stakeholder engagement and lawyers and economics. And we got what you need. That's it. My contact info is there. I think this now goes back to Scott.
Yep. Thank you, Clark. Kansas State University will be providing reviews of applications this year, as always. We like to turn those around in about 3 working days. We are also first come, first serve. Perhaps it's better to call us ahead of time and schedule, though. You know, we'll reserve a time for you. We have a few people doing that in-house. We also have some of our partners that do it for us. Last year, I believe we reviewed 64 applications. So we get a lot of them. As I mentioned earlier, if you have anybody review it, you're likely to have more success than if not. This year, Maggie Bellinger will be the one coordinating our reviews. Her email's here, and you can schedule the review with her. Next, this goes to Joelle.
Thanks, Scott. So rounding this whole great group of TABers, Center for Creative Land Recycling is also here to help you. We say, and I want to introduce, and you've probably all seen Ignacio answering some questions out there. So Ignacio is awesome. Great to have him on the team. And together we're going to be reviewing, reviewing the grants, the applications. November 17th, we say is the deadline for review. We've never turned anyone down. So just email us and we will work with you. Remember, this is only 2 weeks before the submittal due date. And also December 1st, which is the deadline, is the Wednesday after the Thanksgiving Day holiday. So I don't know about you, but I would encourage, EPA is also encouraging people to get the applications in as early as possible. Don't wait till midnight. We have another slide, if you can just advance. We do offer a red line and a rubrics, which basically points out what's going on. But anyway, so start early. And I can't say enough that you've got a wonderful group of TABers here to help everyone. So good luck, everyone. And I'm going to hand it back to Scott.
All right, thank you, Joelle. Somebody asked in the chat, these slides will be available on the KSU tab webinar website that we had for it. And there'll also be the recording. I think I mentioned that earlier. And that will be something that'll be there too, is I want you to see on this slide is some of the links that we've included here. EPA has put together a resources page, and this is fantastic. It has all the guidelines you can get to from there, summary of the changes. It's nice to take a look and see what they've changed from last year. It kind of points to what they might be emphasizing. Joelle hit on that a little bit. You know, they wouldn't have changed things unless it's somewhat important, and they're going to want you to address things that have changed. Also, the slides are there from last week's EPA webinar. Something you can also get to from there, but I added a special link for it here, is the frequently asked questions about MARC grants. For example, you know, this year in section 1BII, you know, outcomes and benefits of reuse strategy, they added a requirement for you to talk about how things benefit disadvantaged communities. That definition is in there. There are so many things in the frequently asked questions. You know, even if you don't have something specific you're hunting for, it wouldn't hurt just to run through those and just see all the things that are in there. Also, I've included the link here for the Tab EZ software tool. Next slide, please. All right. We are kind of done with the presentation portion. We've been answering questions in the chat. I say we, mostly that's Pit Ignacio from C-Claire and Maggie here from KSU. I want to thank them for helping out with that. If you have questions though, we have time now. We're going to stick around and answer those. Also, during this question and answer time, if you could take the time, it would be appreciated to do an evaluation of this webinar. There is the link there. I'm going to put that in the chat as well. And also, if you want to get fancy, you can take a picture of the QR code and that will pop up the evaluation too. We try to do those evaluations at most of our webinars. This is actually, you know, kind of an important one because this is an annual webinar and we want it to be as helpful as possible. So if you can fill that out, tell us what was good, tell us what wasn't good, and you know, we'll try to keep improving these things. Okay, so I'll just leave that up there for now, and we'll start doing question and answers here from the chat. It seems like things are getting answered here. Also, I know everybody's muted. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a specific question. Devin, does everybody have the ability to do that? Can they all unmute if they want?
Yep, that should be a good to go.
All right.
Yes, I was gonna say, it's just with grant funds that if you used brownfield funds before, you can't use brownfield funds again on that site. But obviously, if you use brownfield funds to assess it and then you used RLF funds, that's a different situation.
All right. See, one of the questions is, will this question answer everything in the chat? Will that be available with the slides later? And I'm going to defer to Devin on that. For all of you done, Devin with Seekler, she's been the one helping at the back end doing the slides and stuff today. So, Devin, is this chat conversation going to be something that we can get to?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I can make that available as well.
Okay. We will also post that on the KSU tab event webpage when we get the slides and the recording there.
Don't be shy, guys. Don't wait for it to be fully ready with your applications. Obviously, yes, but one of the things I forgot to mention that CClear also does, and I'm not sure about the other tabbers, we review, and if you are lacking and you come back, we do a second review. So if you're waiting for everything to be perfect, you might want to start that sooner for the review, okay? It means that you have to have made your best effort, okay? It doesn't mean throw anything that you've put together, okay?
Something else to add, when you're requesting a review, if you want to highlight specific areas, you can just send the document for review, but you might say, hey, look at how please take a look at how I did the project description. Or if there's a certain area you want assistance with, don't be shy about asking. We're happy to provide some extra attention to the areas that you want.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Maggie Bellinger with KSU Tab, and I just wanted to make a quick clarification. I posted it in the chat, but I don't know if everyone saw it. There was a question about the 70% drawdown for assessment grants applying to RLF applicants this year, and no, that requirement does not apply. However, if you were a multi-purpose grant recipient, that 70% does apply to RLFs this year. So if you're coming in for an RLF application this year and you're a multi-purpose grant recipient, you do have to demonstrate that 70% drawdown. I just wanted to clarify that.
Scott, let me just mention one other, like if I had to kind of give one bit of advice to whoever, if you're applying and hopefully you're in the process of putting that application together now. I think the single bit of bit of advice I can give is that really read the EPA guidelines. EPA does a pretty good job in outlining what they want answered in each section. And I always recommend when people call me up, there's two, you'll notice that there's a narrative and a ranking criteria, and you'll also notice that there's an evaluation criteria. So I always kind of think of it in these terms, that the narrative ranking criteria is to kind of put you in the spirit of what they're looking for in that section. But the evaluation criteria, that's the one that the EPA reviewer is going to have opened up in front of them when they evaluate your application. And that lists exactly what you're going to be scored on, what needs to be in that section. So I always tell people, write your application to the evaluation criteria, because that is what they're going to use to score your application. So that would be my one nugget of advice.
Keep it simple, right, Sean? Do not become verbose. This is not the place to be verbose. Answer the
Absolutely, yeah.
question.
Answer the question. And that's another, that's great. I'm glad you mentioned that, Joelle, because, also if for some reason a section, you don't have the information or it doesn't apply, say so. Just don't skip it. Mention why it's not relevant to your project. There's no, you're not going to pull the wool over anybody's eyes, especially EPA's with these applications. So, make that statement and then you go on to your next section and answer that question.
And down, have somebody else read it, a colleague, whatever, to somebody who
Doesn't have any knowledge, actually. Would be great.
exactly.
Yep.
Right. Just test it out. And then, because if you get so close to it that you will read thing and there's not a typo in it, and someone reads it and goes, you missed the, you're like, what? So it's because you're so close to it. So give it to somebody else that, has nothing to do with it and goes, oh, okay, but what's this acronym? Right. They're going to point out things that, and they'll tell you whether you tell them you have 500,000 in your pocket, which to me, is it a compelling enough story? Did I put enough data? Have I painted the picture clear for you?
And another good thing is, especially a lot of these applications, when they come out of a city or a municipal department, certain people write certain sections of it, and it can be very noticeable that that's what occurred. So if you have somebody available to you that has some editing skills that can read through it to kind of smooth out from section to section and have each section build on the previous, I would recommend doing that as well. Because a lot of time, not everybody who is responsible for filling this out, they're gathering information from 4 other people to complete the information that's required in the application. You want to make sure that you have somebody who can edit that and smooth it out for you.
Yeah, folks, Paul had a question about can you apply annually? It's according to the guidelines, as long as you've drawn down 70%, but that's kind of impossible if you applied last year and spent 70% already. So that's kind of, it is possible, but it's probably improbable.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ignacio. Yeah, you want to balance your time out. That's what it gets into. The tasks went by end of third quarter, by first quarter of, right? So you're showing how you're spacing, you understand the time that it's going to take. Of course, nobody could have anticipated COVID, but that's when, you get into revising work plans and stuff. So.
I'd like to mention that while we were in on this webinar, Sherry Walsh in our office actually has posted the slides and the agenda on the website. So it's already there and the recording will follow.
Great.
Now that's service, Scott.
Yeah.
The other, Sean, you brought up the whole voice. So the voice of the application, whose voice it's in. So whether it's the municipality writing or the planning, whoever, the consultant, I know a number of consultants on this, make sure that if you're writing it, the voice sounds proper. If that makes sense. Like you may feel, don't write it so that it's detached from you're actually doing the municipality, like who the actual applicant is. Make sure that their relationship and the voice is correct from who is going to be awarded and responsible for that cooperative agreement. Other than that, you've got 5 weeks. Bite off a section. If you haven't started, bite off a section each week and do it. Pace yourself, and then you can have a relaxing holiday instead of trying to forward on the day of that it's due, or at 11:57 at night.
All right, it looks like the trickle of questions has ended. I'd like to thank Joelle and Sean for speaking today, and for Clark and Felly, Katie for being here from their tabs. And really, just get a hold of us. You know, we're here to help. And you know, one thing about it, you know, the tabs, we are kind of assigned geographically, but we do work together. We realize there are strengths in the other groups, and we share answers and resources. And so, you know, you will get more of a coordinated effort than just, you know, one person looking at your question. We will try to find the right thing and use each other appropriately to do that. So,
Absolutely.
if that's all, we'll call this good.
All
All right.
everyone, good luck.
Thank
Good
y'all.
luck.
Good luck
Thank
on
you.
your applications.